How one black republic crushed Napoleon and was erased for it. In 2026, the United States waved Haiti's World Cup players through the gate and turned their fans away at the border. The team had earned this trip fair and clean, qualifying match by match like every other nation in the tournament. The families who raised those players were told their whole nation was too dangerous to let inside. You are watching this happen in front of the whole world, live on television, and almost no one is stopping to ask why. This is the shape of the 2026 U.S. travel ban in one image. Athletes waved through customs, while their own families were blocked at the counter behind them. I believe that single image tells you most of what you need to know about how bans like this actually work. It was never really about danger. A whole nation was treated as a threat because of where its people were born, not because of anything a single one of them had done. And here is the part that should stop you cold. This is not the first time the world looked at Haiti and decided it was too dangerous to be free. Here is the real question worth sitting with. Why does one small Caribbean nation, roughly the size of Maryland, still make the most powerful countries on earth nervous 200 years after the fact? Haiti is the only nation on earth born from a successful slave revolt. Not a rebellion that was crushed within a season. Not an uprising that ends up as a footnote in someone else's history book. A revolt that won, that built an army out of people who had been property a decade earlier, and that beat the empire sent across the Atlantic to put them back in chains.
I have sat with that fact for a long time, and it still does not fully leave you once you let it in. I know that claim sounds too large to be truth. Many of us were never given the receipt for it in school, so it is fair to want proof before you believed it.
You are going to get dates. You are going to get names. You are going to get the actual battlefield where this happened, and the actual document that made it official, because a story this size does not need exaggeration. It needs the record laid out in front of you. Here is the story America is punishing them for tonight. In the early 1800s, an army of formerly enslaved men and women broke the finest army Napoleon Bonaparte ever sent across an ocean, a force built from veterans of his European wars. And it still was not enough. On January 1st, 1804, that army founded the first black republic in the modern world. I'd bet almost nothing in that last paragraph was in your history textbook. Most Americans finish high school without ever hearing Haiti's name spoken in the same breath as Napoleon's defeat. You were never taught this in school, and I don't think that gap is an accident. By the end of this hour, I believe you will understand exactly who benefited from that silence, and why a small nation still gets treated like a threat for the crime of having won its freedom first. But before we get to Napoleon, before we get to the general who broke him, you need to see the place this whole story actually starts. A colony so profitable, it was called the richest piece of land on the face of the earth. Picture the western third of the island of Hispaniola in the 1780s. Ships crowd the harbor at Cap Francais so thick that sailors joke you could walk from deck to deck without ever touching water. Warehouses along the wharf are stacked floor to ceiling with barrels, sugar going pale and sweet in the Caribbean heat, coffee beans still green from the mountain slopes, rising just above the bay. This is Saint-Domingue, France's colony on the western half of the island, and by the 1780s, it is the single richest colony on the face of the earth. I believe that claim needs a number attached to it, not just an adjective. So here is the number. Saint-Domingue alone produced most of the world's sugar and most of the world's coffee at the same time. One colony, smaller than the state of Maryland, feeding breakfast tables from Paris to Vienna to the drawing rooms of London itself. That wealth did not stay on the island. It crossed the Atlantic in the holds of merchant ships and landed in two French ports above all others, Bordeaux and Nantes, where it built townhouses, funded banks, and turned modest trading families into the aristocracy of French commerce almost overnight. Walk through the old quarters of either city today, many historians will tell you, and you are walking past stone buildings paid for with Saint-Domingue sugar and Saint-Domingue coffee. Merchant houses that had traded modest cargoes a generation earlier were suddenly financing entire fleets. By the 1780s, This one colony was being called the crown jewel of France's entire empire, worth more to the French treasury, by many accounts, than all of France's other overseas colonies put together. I've sat with that comparison for a long time, because it reframes the whole story before the story has even started. This was not a struggling outpost that got lucky with one good harvest. This was the engine room of French wealth, running at full output in the exact decade before it exploded. Diplomats in Paris measured the health of the French economy, partly by the ships coming out of Cap Français. Investors across Europe watched the sugar and coffee prices out of this one colony, the way people today watch an oil market, and an engine running that hot, generation after generation, has to be fed by something. In Saint-Domingue, it was fed by human beings, and the machine built to feed it was built on a scale that is hard to hold in your mind even now. Historians place the enslaved population of Saint-Domingue at roughly 500,000 people by the late 1780s, outnumbering the colony's free population by something like 10 to 1. Sit with that ratio for a second. In a colony that size, nearly everyone you would have passed on a road, in a field, along a wharf, was living in bondage. That number alone should stop you, but the harder number is what happened to it every single year. Conditions on the sugar plantations were so brutal that mortality ran far higher than birth rates among the enslaved population, which meant the plantations could never sustain their own workforce through births alone, no matter how large the population grew. Ships kept crossing from West and Central Africa constantly, bringing new captives to replace the ones the fields had already used up. I don't think there is a gentle way to say what that means, so I won't try to soften it. The sugar economy of Saint-Domingue consumed human lives at a pace that required constant replacement, year after year, decade after decade. An unbroken chain of ships, crossing an ocean to keep one crop moving toward one market. Cane cutting, boiling, hauling, the grinding season shifts that ran through the night, beside open fires under the boiling houses. The machinery of a sugar plantation did not slow down for exhaustion, for injury, or for grief. Many of us who have read the plantation ledgers from this period come away with the same cold feeling. These were treated as entries to be replaced, not as people to be preserved. A mill needed hands. A field needed hands. When hands broke down under the boiling houses or the cane knives, more were purchased at the next auction, and the ledger simply moved on to the next line as if nothing had happened at all. Stay with that image for a moment, because it explains everything that comes next in this story. A colony built this profitable on a foundation this brutal was never going to hold together quietly forever, and the men who ran it knew that, even as they built an entire society designed to keep the lid pressed down. That society ran on a rigid racial caste, enforced by law and backed by the constant threat of violence at every level of daily life. At the top sat white planters and colonial officials, holding both the land and the courts. Below them sat a group historians call the gens du couleur libre, free people of color, many of them property owners and, in some documented cases, slaveholders themselves, who were nonetheless denied full legal and political rights simply because of their ancestry. Contrary to what many people assume about slave societies, Saint-Domingue's caste system did not divide neatly along a single line of free versus enslaved. It layered status on top of status, and every layer existed to remind whoever stood underneath exactly where the ceiling was set for them. Beneath all of that sat the enslaved majority, the roughly 500,000 human beings the whole colony's wealth was built on top of, and the system did not stop at forced labor alone. Code Noir regulations and plantation custom worked together to strip enslaved people of their birth names, discourage the languages they had carried across the ocean, and deny them the basic legal standing of being recognized as full human beings under French law. I believe it is worth naming plainly what that kind of stripping does to a person, generation after generation. It is not incidental cruelty. It is engineered methodically to make rebellion feel unthinkable, right up until the exact moment it stops working. Because underneath the wealth, underneath the ports and the warehouses, and the caste laws written up in careful French legal script, something had been building for years that no amount of law could hold forever. The same colony that was making France rich was also, quietly, making itself a furnace. Free people of color petitioned Paris for rights and were refused, again and again, by officials who never once set foot on the island whose profits they were spending. Enslaved communities kept their own languages and their own faiths alive in secret, generation after generation, waiting for a moment none of them could yet name. I believe that patience, held that long under that much pressure, deserves to be understood as its own kind of resistance, not passivity. What happened next did not start with an army marching in formation. It started at night, in a forest clearing, with a ceremony almost nobody sipping coffee in Paris ever heard about. Picture a forest clearing outside Cap Français, on a storm-heavy night in August of 1791. Rain moving in off the mountains, firelight catching on wet leaves. Enslaved men and women from plantations across the northern plain had slipped away from their quarters in the dark, walking miles on paths only they knew, to gather at a place called Bois Cayman, Alligator Woods. Historians describe the ceremony that night in slightly different ways, since almost none of it was written down by the people who lived it, but the broad shape of the story has held for over 2 centuries. This was the Bois Cayman ceremony, and it is where most historians mark the true beginning of the Haitian Revolution. At the center of that gathering, most accounts place a man named Dati Boukman, a leader among the enslaved, remembered as commanding, sharp-eyed, and unwilling to be small in front of anyone. Beside him, tradition holds, stood a priestess named Cécile Fatiman, her presence woven so tightly into the story that Vodou practice and revolutionary memory have never fully separated the two since. I believe it matters that a woman stands at the center of this founding story, not at its edge, even though the written record around her is thinner than any of us would like. Many of the details come down through oral tradition rather than a colonial ledger, and I think that is worth saying plainly rather than pretending otherwise. What happened next, according to the tradition passed down through generations, was an oath. A pig was sacrificed. Blood was shared among those gathered, sealing a pact that bound them to one another before any of them had lifted a weapon. Boukman is remembered as speaking that night of a god who demanded vengeance, of a freedom that was owed and not merely wished for, of a fight that every person in that clearing was now bound to.
I've come back to that image many times. A circle of people, most of them enslaved that very afternoon, making a promise to each other in the rain that none of them could take back. This is not a myth added later for drama, even though it has picked up the texture of legend over 200 years of retelling.
Historians across very different traditions agree that some real gathering took place in this period, that it functioned as an organizing moment across plantations that had no other way to coordinate openly, and that within days of it, the story of what happened at Bois Cayman had traveled farther and faster than any single planter could contain. An oath, sworn in secret, in the dark, among people the colony had spent generations trying to convince they were powerless. And it worked exactly the opposite way the colony needed it to. Think about the logistics alone for a moment, because I think we skip past this too quickly. Word had to move between plantations that were miles apart, past overseers, past patrols, past every system the colony had built specifically to keep enslaved people isolated from one another. It moved anyway, plantation to plantation, in whispers and coded signals, until enough people knew the plan that it could not be stopped by punishing any single messenger. In my reading of this period, that quiet network is every bit as remarkable as the ceremony itself, an entire underground communication system, built and run by people the law refused to recognize as capable of organizing anything at all. I think about how much courage that takes, and I don't say that lightly. Every person walking to that clearing knew the punishment for what they were about to do. They came anyway. That is the part of this story I keep sitting with longest. Not the fire that followed, but the walk there in the dark, before anyone knew if the plan would hold. Within days, that quiet oath in the forest would not stay quiet. It would turn into flame across an entire province, and by the time the colonial government understood what it was looking at, the northern plain was already burning. By the second week of August 1791, the northern plain of Saint-Domingue was burning. Not one plantation, not 10. Hundreds of plantations were set aflame within a matter of days, cane fields lit at the edges and left to run. The fire climbing toward the great houses in long orange walls that ships anchored off Cap Français could see from the water. Overseers who had ruled with the whip a week earlier were now running for the coast, in whatever clothes they'd grabbed on their way out the door. I've sat with the plantation registers from that autumn for a long time, and the pattern in the numbers is almost eerie. Estate after estate simply stops reporting. Mid-entry, mid-sentence. What formed underneath that fire was not chaos. Within weeks, the people who had been enslaved on those estates organized themselves into an army, thousands strong, then tens of thousands, moving at night, striking at dawn, falling back into the mountains before colonial militias could regroup and answer. They already had leaders, men like Dutty Boukman in the first days, and others who stepped forward once he fell in battle. This was not a riot that burned itself out by morning. It was a war being assembled under real pressure, built by people who had spent years, some of them decades, learning the exact terrain of the plantations they now turned against their owners. The colonial planters who survived those first nights did not stay to fight. Cap Français filled with refugees within a month. Families who had run sugar and coffee fortunes for a generation now crowding onto ships bound for Baltimore, Philadelphia, and New Orleans, carrying whatever jewelry they'd managed to sew into coat linings, and little else besides. Some accounts from that autumn describe whole parishes emptied of their colonial population inside 2 weeks. I don't think that speed was an accident worth glossing over. It tells you something about how thin the colony's control actually was underneath all that wealth. One match, and a structure built over a century came down faster than anyone in Paris wanted to believe. None of this happened in isolation. Back in France, the revolution that had begun in 1789 was tearing the old order apart. A king on trial, a national assembly fighting over the very meaning of rights, a treasury stretched thin by war on its own continent. Paris had neither the ships nor the soldiers to spare for a colonial uprising 3,000 miles away, and for the first 2 years, that absence was the rebellion's greatest ally. The same empire that had built Saint-Domingue into the richest colony on earth was now too busy fighting for its own survival to defend it. Spain and Britain noticed the opening. By 1793, both powers had sent armies into Saint-Domingue, not to help anyone free themselves, but to seize the colony for their own crowns, while France was distracted at home. Spanish forces crossed from the eastern side of the island, recruiting rebel commanders into their ranks with promises of freedom and military rank. British troops landed on the western coast, backed by French planters willing to hand their own colony to a foreign power if it meant keeping the plantation system intact. What had started as a revolt against one system of bondage had become something larger. A war of empires, fought on Haitian soil, with the very people who set the first fire suddenly holding the balance of power between 3 of them. Most of what I was taught about this period, growing up, treated it as a footnote to the French Revolution, a colonial disturbance mentioned in a single sentence, if it was mentioned at all. Here's where I've landed after years of reading the actual campaign records. This was never a footnote. It was the moment an uprising stopped being a local matter and became a prize. 3 European powers were willing to spend armies fighting over, and the force they were all trying to buy, contain, or destroy was one that had built itself out of nothing. In the span of a single burning season, into that 3-way scramble stepped a man almost none of the European commanders had heard of yet. His name was Toussaint, and by the time Spain, Britain, and France finished counting their soldiers, he would be the reason not one of the 3 left the island with what they came for. He was born enslaved, probably around 1743, on the Breda plantation just outside Cap Français, the same northern plain that would later burn in 1791. His father is remembered in some accounts as a man of standing in West Africa before capture. What's better documented is that Toussaint spent the first 5 decades of his life as another man's property, working first in the cane fields, and then, as his owners came to recognize his intelligence, as a coachman and livestock handler on the estate. I want you to sit with that detail for a second. The man who would outplan 3 empires spent his 40s driving another man's carriage. He was almost entirely self-educated. Some accounts credit a sympathetic godfather or a plantation priest with early lessons. What's well documented is that by adulthood he was reading Julius Caesar's commentaries on war, French military manuals, and Enlightenment writers most free men of his era never touched. There's no single, tidy record of how a coachman got access to books like that. I've come to believe it says less about any one mentor, and more about a man who simply refused to stay inside the limits set for him. He read in the hours he wasn't required to work in the fields. He kept reading long after most people in his position would have stopped believing it mattered. Somewhere in his 40s, Toussaint gained his legal freedom. The record on the exact year is thin, but by the late 1770s he was working the Breda estate as a free man, managing livestock and even leasing a small plot of his own. It's easy to picture that as a quiet, settled life, and for a while it may have been exactly that. A free black man in his 40s, literate, respected on his own plantation, with no obvious reason to risk everything. Then came 1791. When the fires reached the Breda Plain, Toussaint didn't run for the coast with the planters, and he didn't stand still either. He sent his former master's family to safety first, by most accounts, and then rode north to join the rebellion he had spent a lifetime preparing, without knowing it, to lead. When the fighting reached full scale in the months after 1791, Toussaint was already in his late 40s, older than almost every rebel commander around him, and on paper, about the least likely soldier in the province. Within 2 years, he had turned scattered bands of the formerly enslaved into a disciplined fighting force, drilled, provisioned, and capable of maneuvering in formation against European regulars, instead of only raiding and retreating into the hills. French, Spanish, and British officers who fought him left records calling him, at different points in the war, a natural genius, an unteachable savage, and, once they'd lost enough battles to him, simply the old fox. I've sat with those officer letters for a long time, the ones written right after a defeat, and the tone shifts almost overnight. Contempt curdles into something close to fear. That shift was the miscalculation sitting at the center of everything Spain, Britain, and France did next. Each of them looked at a man born enslaved, self-taught, and past 50, and assumed the categories they already knew, planter, soldier, statesman, simply didn't apply to someone like him. They were wrong, in ways that would cost each empire dearly over the next 8 years, starting with the 2 powers who believed they could simply buy his loyalty and keep it. That old fox spent the next 8 years proving them wrong, one empire at a time. In 1793, invited into the fighting on the Spanish side, the side offering the clearest promise of freedom at that moment, Toussaint accepted a command, learned everything he could about Spanish supply lines and French colonial politics from the inside, and then, in 1794, switched sides entirely the moment France's revolutionary government abolished slavery outright. Under enormous pressure from the very revolt he was helping lead, it was a calculated gamble on which flag would actually deliver freedom, and it paid off almost immediately. France now had, in Toussaint, a general who understood the terrain, the enemy, and his own people better than any officer Paris could ever have shipped across the Atlantic. Fighting now under the French tricolor, he turned on the armies that had, until recently, paid his salary. Spanish forces, overextended and unable to match his speed in the mountains, were pushed back across the eastern border by 1795. British troops fared even worse. Sent to seize the colony's sugar wealth for the crown, they instead spent 5 years bleeding soldiers to combat disease, and a commander who never once fought the battle they'd prepared for. By 1798, what remained of the British expedition withdrew, Having lost, by some counts, tens of thousands of men to a campaign, London had expected to be a quick and profitable land grab. By 1801, Toussaint governed the entire island, not just the French-speaking west and north, but the Spanish-speaking east as well, which he occupied and folded into a single administration under his command. A man born enslaved on a sugar estate, now controlled ports, customs houses, and an army larger than anything the region had ever seen. Plantations reopened under his rule, though now the labor was paid rather than owned outright, run under a strict military discipline he imposed to keep the colony's shattered sugar economy alive. Foreign merchants negotiated trade terms with his government directly, as though it were any other state, and American ships out of Philadelphia and New York carried on commerce with the colony almost as freely as they had under French governors. In 8 years, the coachman from Breda had become, in practice if not yet in official title, the head of state of the wealthiest colony France had ever possessed, a fact that no European government had a script ready for. Then, in 1801, Toussaint did something no colonial power expected, and no enslaver could forgive. He wrote a constitution. It abolished slavery permanently on the island, not as a wartime concession that could be reversed once convenient, but as fixed, standing law. It named him governor for life, gave the colony its own courts, its own trade policy, and its own standing army, while keeping on paper a thin declaration of loyalty to France. That last part mattered. Toussaint wasn't declaring outright independence. Not yet. He was building a self-governing black state that happened to still fly the French flag, daring Paris to accept an arrangement it had never imagined and never wanted to imagine. Between you and me, I think that Constitution is one of the most underrated documents most people have never heard of. Quieter than the battle at Vertières, that was still 2 years off, but in some ways, just as radical a strike. Napoleon Bonaparte, who by 1801 had made himself first consul of France, and was already dreaming of an American empire built on Caribbean sugar and Louisiana grain, read Toussaint's Constitution exactly as it was meant to be read, as a declaration that a colony of the formerly enslaved now considered itself beyond his personal control. He wasn't going to let that stand. What he sent across the Atlantic next would be the largest expedition France had ever launched. Napoleon read that 1801 Constitution the way a general reads an enemy's declaration, not as paperwork, but as a challenge aimed straight at him. A self-governing black colony, flying its own flag in everything but name, now sat on the same map as his plans for a new French empire in the Americas. Within weeks, he decided Saint-Domingue would be brought back under his control, whatever the price turned out to be. The price began with numbers most people never hear. Through the final months of 1801 and into early 1802, more than 6 ships gathered in the harbors of Brest, Rochefort, and Lorient, loaded with tens of thousands of soldiers, cannon, cavalry horses, and enough powder to fight a continental war on foreign sand. French naval records call it the largest expedition the nation had ever sent across an ocean, bigger than anything dispatched to Egypt 3 years earlier. By the time every reinforcement finished crossing through 1802, the combined force climbed toward 40,000 men, aimed at a colony smaller than the state of Maryland. Sit with that ratio for a second. 40,000 of Europe's most seasoned soldiers against a population Napoleon assumed was still, at its core, a mass of frightened former slaves. This was not a militia scraped together for a colonial policing job. Whole veteran regiments that had marched with Napoleon through Italy and Egypt were pulled off garrison duty and loaded onto transports, alongside elite grenadier companies, dragoons, and artillery batteries hauling field guns, rated for a continental battlefield. Several of Napoleon's own trusted division commanders, men who had proven themselves against Austrian and Ottoman armies, were assigned posts under Leclerc. I've sat with that roster for a long time, and here's where I land. You do not send that caliber of officer and that density of veteran troops to manage an unruly province. You send it to break something. You expect to fight hard and to win no matter the cost in lives. At the head of that armada stood General Charles Leclerc, a battle-hardened commander not yet 30, married to Napoleon's own sister, Pauline Bonaparte. That marriage is not a footnote. Napoleon did not send a stranger to reconquer his most valuable colony. He sent family. Someone whose triumph would be a Bonaparte triumph, and whose failure he could not easily forgive. I've come to believe that detail gets skipped in most retellings, and it shouldn't, because it shows exactly how personal this mission was to the man who ordered it. Publicly, the expedition was framed as nothing more than restoring French administration, an internal matter of putting a colony back in order. Many popular accounts still repeat that version, but Leclerc's own written instructions and Napoleon's private letters to his ministers tell a fuller story. Disarm the population. Remove Toussaint and his officers from every position of command. And then, once resistance had been broken, quietly bring slavery back. That final order stayed sealed while the largest fleet France had ever launched crossed an ocean toward a people who had already tasted what freedom felt like. Picture the scene at the water's edge in Brest that winter, sails filling one after another until the horizon itself seemed to be made of canvas. Soldiers who had marched through Italy and Egypt, now boarding ships bound for a Caribbean colony, most of them had never heard named correctly. Officers wrote letters home describing the crossing as a grand adventure, a chance to see the famous Caribbean colony everyone in Paris talked about. None of them yet knew the second order tucked inside their general's papers, folded away from ordinary eyes until the moment it would be needed. Somewhere in that same fleet, though almost no one aboard knew it yet, sailed the exact machinery that would, within 2 years, be shattered on the same soil it meant to conquer. They believed they were sailing to restore order. They were, in fact, sailing to restore chains. And once Leclerc's army came ashore, that intention started working itself out, with a cruelty that still startles me every time I go back through the primary sources. By the spring of 1802, after months of brutal fighting, Leclerc turned to a tactic that cost France nothing on the battlefield and everything in the court of history. He invited Toussaint Louverture to a peace conference, offering guarantees of safety, the language of reconciliation, the promise of a quiet retirement on his own land. General Jean-Baptiste Brunet extended the invitation personally, in writing, choosing the small town of Gonaives as the meeting place, close enough to Toussaint's own territory that it must have felt safe. Toussaint came under a flag of truce, riding in with a handful of men, and no reason to expect betrayal after years of dealing with French officers on formal terms. He was arrested on the spot in June of 1802, bound like the men and women he had spent a decade fighting to free, and marched onto a French warship before his own officers understood what had happened. France carried him across the Atlantic and buried him, essentially alive, inside Fort de Joux, a stone prison high in the French Alps, built for exactly this kind of isolation, cutting a man off from everything and everyone he knew. No fire that could properly warm the cell, no trial, no visit from family.
I will admit, of every scene in this whole revolution, this is the one that stayed with me the longest. An old general who had outmaneuvered 3 empires, dying of cold and neglect in a mountain cell while the colony he built kept fighting on without him.
He died there in April of 1803, and Leclerc never explained to his own soldiers exactly why the man who had led an entire army had suddenly vanished from the story. Then the fever came, and it did not care which side of the flag of truce anyone stood on. Yellow fever tore through Leclerc's camps that summer, with a speed no cannon could match, killing freshly arrived French troops by the thousands while soldiers born in the Caribbean, carrying some natural resistance, held on longer. Hospital logs from Cap Français describe entire regiments reduced to a handful of men, able to stand watch through the night. Many of the physicians treating the sick had never encountered yellow fever before and had no real defense against it, beyond bleeding patients and hoping the disease would run its course before the wards emptied entirely. Leclerc himself caught the fever and died in November of 1802, only months after the arrest he had personally engineered, leaving his young widow Pauline to sail home carrying his remains rather than a victory. By some estimates, more than half of the original expedition, tens of thousands of men, lay dead of disease before the second phase of this war had even truly begun. I don't think a single general on that fleet ever imagined a mosquito would outfight Napoleon's army where cannon fire could not. And then came the confirmation nobody in the colony needed spelled out twice. In May of 1802, word reached Saint-Domingue that France had formally restored slavery on the nearby island of Guadeloupe, crushing that colony's resistance in blood to make the point unmistakable. Whatever doubt remained about Leclerc's true purpose evaporated in a matter of days. The formerly enslaved officers, who had rejoined French ranks after Toussaint's arrest, finally understood exactly what waited for them if France won this war. They deserted in waves, weapons still in hand, and a fight that had cooled for a season reignited with a fury that made the first uprising of 1791 look almost restrained by comparison. Many of us who study this war read Guadeloupe as the single moment everything changed. The instant a rumor became a documented fact, no one on the island could unhear. There was no diplomacy left to attempt after that, and no reason left to trust a single French promise again. News of Toussaint's death reached the colony slowly, filtering through rumor and captured letters, but it changed the temperature of the entire war the moment it landed. The man who stepped into the vacuum was Jean-Jacques Dessalines, a general who had fought at Toussaint's side since the earliest days of the uprising, and had learned, better than almost anyone alive, exactly what a French promise was worth once the ink dried. Where Toussaint had spent years trying to hold together some workable version of loyalty to France, Dessalines simply stopped believing reconciliation was possible at all. He moved fast to unite a resistance that had splintered into rival factions and personal armies scattered across the colony's mountains and plains. Officers who had spent months distrusting one another, men like Alexandre Pétion and Henri Christophe among them, found themselves folded into a single command structure under Dessalines, fighting behind one banner instead of a dozen competing flags. Some of these same men had briefly fought on opposing sides during earlier internal disputes, rivalries that under normal circumstances would have taken years to mend. Dessalines pushed past that history with blunt urgency, treating the French threat as large enough to make old grievances a luxury nobody could afford anymore. I think that unification is one of the most underrated turns in the entire war, because a fractured resistance almost never beats a professional European army, and a unified one, suddenly, had a real and terrifying chance. From that point forward, the war stopped being a negotiation interrupted by violence and became something closer to total war, fought by both sides without illusions. Dessalines is remembered, fairly or not, for a brutal clarity of purpose, the conviction that this fight would only end when one side or the other no longer stood on the island at all. Whatever you make of that severity, and I don't think it's a simple thing to judge from a comfortable distance, it grew out of watching a leader who trusted French terms get chained and shipped off to die in a mountain fortress. By the autumn of 1803, that resolve had hardened an entire army into something the French had not yet faced in this colony. Soldiers with nothing left to negotiate for, and everything left to prove. What had begun 12 years earlier as scattered plantation revolts had become, under Dessalines, a coordinated national army moving with a single purpose toward a single outcome. That final proof came on November 18th, 1803, on a ridge of high ground above the port city then called Cap Français, the place we know today as Cap Haitien. General Donatien Rochambeau, who had taken command after Leclerc's death from fever, dug his remaining troops into fortified positions along those heights, the last real defensive line standing between Dessalines' army and total French collapse in the colony. What followed became, almost immediately, the story every surviving veteran of that campaign would tell for the rest of their lives. The battle later remembered simply as Vertières. Among Dessalines' officers that morning rode François Capois, a commander whose nerve under fire earned him a name that outlived the battle itself. Capois, La Mort, Capois of Death. Leading his column directly into French cannon and musket fire, Capois had his horse shot out from under him, climbed onto a second horse without breaking stride, and kept charging the entrenched line as though the bullets simply did not apply to him. Multiple accounts, including ones written by French officers watching from behind their own earthworks, describe genuine astonishment rippling across that ridge. Men on the losing end of a war, reportedly pausing their fire to cheer a single enemy officer's courage before returning, grimly, to the business of trying to kill him. I've read that detail from more than one source now, and I still find it remarkable. Soldiers who had been ordered to hold that line at any cost, briefly setting aside the war itself to honor what they were watching. That charge, and the wave of soldiers who followed it up the slope behind him, broke something in the French position that never fully reformed. The fortified line above Cap Français, the last serious defensive works Rochambeau's army had left in the entire colony, gave way under an assault that showed no sign of stopping and no interest in retreating. What began that morning as one more contested ridge in a war already 11 years old, ended that afternoon as the collapse of French military hope on the island, a hope that had already been dying of fever, hunger, and desertion for more than a year before Capua ever spurred that second horse forward. Word of what happened on those heights spread through the ranks on both sides before nightfall, and it changed how each army understood the war it was fighting. For Dessalines' soldiers, Vertières became living evidence, felt immediately in their own ranks that the empire sent to re-enslave them could be broken on open ground, not just outlasted through fever and famine. Here's where I land after sitting with the sources on this one. Vertières mattered less because of the ground it changed hands over, and more because of what it proved possible to soldiers who had grown up believing an army like Rochambeau's could never be beaten in the open. By the third week of November 1803, General Donatien Rochambeau had run out of army. The man who had once commanded the finest expeditionary force France could ship across an ocean was now penned inside Cap Français, with a garrison of exhausted, fever-thinned men and no reinforcements coming behind them. Vertières had broken more than a line of trenches on a hillside. It had broken the idea that this war was still winnable. On November 18th, the same day the guns fell silent above Cap Haïtien, Rochambeau began negotiating terms. Within 2 weeks, the evacuation was underway. Thousands of French soldiers loaded onto ships, sailing away from a colony Napoleon himself had once called the richest jewel in his empire, the colony that had shipped more sugar and coffee into French ports than every other Caribbean holding combined only a decade earlier. Picture it for a second. The tricolor coming down off the fort, the harbor filling with retreating sails, and on the hills above, an army of the formerly enslaved watching the empire that had claimed to own them simply leave. Here is the plain historical fact, and I think it is worth saying slowly. An army raised largely from men and women who had been legal property under French law only a decade earlier had defeated the army of the most feared military power on earth. Napoleon Bonaparte, the general who had humbled Austria, crossed the Alps, and marched into Egypt, could not hold a single Caribbean colony against Jean-Jacques Dessalines and the veterans Toussaint Louverture had trained. Historians who study this period are fairly unanimous on one point. Saint-Domingue stands as the only slave revolt in recorded history that ended not in punishment, but in the founding of a free, internationally recognized nation. Not a rebellion crushed and folded back into the plantation ledger. A revolution that won outright, in open battle, against a European empire at the height of its power. Between you and me, I don't think most of us were ever handed this version of the story in school. The one most people got taught runs the other way. Europe wins, the colonies wait their turn. Here, the order is reversed, and reversed by force. Rochambeau's ships didn't leave Cap Français because Napoleon had a change of heart in Paris. They left because Dessalines' army made staying impossible, day after day, until there was no garrison left to hold the line. I've sat with that reversal for a long time now, and it still catches me every time I come back to it. How completely the official story of who beats whom gets rewritten by what actually happened on that ground. Victory did not come free, and the ledger of loss deserves to be read honestly, on both sides of it. Napoleon poured tens of thousands of soldiers into Saint-Domingue across 1802 and 1803. General Leclerc's original expedition, then wave after wave of reinforcements sent to replace the dead. Most historians estimate the French lost somewhere in the range of 50,000 men on that island, and the overwhelming majority of them fell not to musket fire but to yellow fever, the same disease that had already killed Leclerc himself in November 1802. Combat took soldiers by the hundred. The fever took them by the thousand. By the time Rochambeau boarded his ship, France had spent one of the largest expeditionary forces it had ever assembled on foreign soil, and lost it entirely. I believe this next part is the piece most textbooks quietly step around. Saint-Domingue was never just a sugar colony in Napoleon's plans. It was meant to be the anchor of a French-American empire, a base position to feed and defend French territory, stretching up through Louisiana and into the heart of the continent. Once the colony was lost, that entire ambition collapsed along with it. Many historians read Vertières as the moment Napoleon's dream of an American empire quietly died, months before the paperwork in Paris ever caught up to the fact. The general who had redrawn the map of Europe found the map of the New World redrawn against him by an army he had refused, until it was far too late to take seriously. Word of what happened at Vertières did not stay in the Caribbean. It crossed the Atlantic in ships' logs and newspaper columns, and it crossed into slave-holding households as something closer to fear than news, to every enslaved person still in bondage. In Jamaica, in Cuba, across the American South, Saint-Domingue became living proof that the impossible had already happened once, on one island, against one empire. To the men who owned plantations and sat on colonial councils, it became the nightmare nobody said out loud at dinner, a warning to one side of that ledger, a beacon to the other. Both readings were true at the same moment, and neither side of the Atlantic could unsee it once Rochambeau's sails disappeared over the horizon. A single defeat that every plantation economy from Havana to Charleston now had to reckon with. On the first morning of January 1804, in the port town of Gonaives, Jean-Jacques Dessalines stood before what remained of the Revolutionary Army and read a declaration that had no precedent anywhere in the modern world. Months earlier, at a congress in Arcahaie, the French tricolor had already been torn in two. On his orders, the white stripe pulled out and cast aside, leaving only the red and the blue sewn back together by hand. Now, at Gonaives, the words caught up to that gesture. The colony once called Saint-Domingue would never again answer to Paris. There would be no more governors, no more colonial council, no more flag with white in it flying over the harbor. Dessalines and his officers signed their names to a single sentence that ended 200 years of French rule in a single stroke. Accounts from that morning described Dessalines pacing before his officers, reportedly seizing the draft document from a secretary and tearing it apart because the language still sounded too much like the polite phrasing of French bureaucrats. He wanted something blunter, something that could not be mistaken for a request. What was finally read aloud, and later signed by dozens of generals, closed with a line that has been translated many different ways over 2 centuries, but always lands on the same idea. Better to die free than live as they had lived before. Whatever the exact wording that morning, the gathered crowd understood the stakes of it immediately. This was not a petition to Paris. It was a closed door. The name they chose to replace it with mattered every bit as much as the declaration itself. Dessalines called the new nation Haiti, an old word from the island's original Taino inhabitants, meaning, roughly, land of high mountains. It was the name the indigenous people had used long before Columbus ever anchored offshore, long before French planters carved the island into sugar estates. Reclaiming it was a pointed act, a way of reaching back past slavery, past the colony, to something that belonged to the land before either empire arrived. I've sat with that choice for a while now, and I think it says as much about what this revolution was reaching for as any battle report does. This wasn't only a war for the right to leave, it was a war for the right to name yourself. and to say so in a language the whole world would eventually have to learn to spell correctly. What came out of Gonaives that morning was, by any honest historical accounting, the first Black republic in the modern world. The first nation anywhere founded and governed by formerly enslaved people, with the abolition of slavery written into its very existence rather than granted later as a concession. No other nation on earth in 1804 could say that. Many historians consider it, alongside the American and French revolutions, one of the three defining political ruptures of the Atlantic world in that era, though it is very often the one left out of the textbook chapter. I believe that omission tells you something about which revolutions get remembered as inevitable, and which ones get treated as an inconvenience, and which ones simply get skipped past on the way to the next chapter. There is a second story running underneath this one, and it starts months before Gonaives, back when Napoleon's army was already dying by the thousand, in the fever season of 1802 and 1803. Napoleon had never sent Leclerc's expedition to Saint-Domingue purely for the sugar. The colony was meant to be the anchor of a much larger French-American empire, one stretching from the Caribbean up through the vast Louisiana territory France had only recently reacquired from Spain. Once it became clear, well before the final surrender, that Saint-Domingue could not be held, that entire plan lost its foundation. On April 30th, 1803, Napoleon's ministers signed a treaty in Paris, selling the Louisiana territory to the United States. The number attached to that sale was about $15 million, and what the United States received for it was roughly 828,000 square miles. A single purchase that doubled the size of the country overnight, stretching its claimed territory from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. President Jefferson's envoys, Robert Livingston and James Monroe, had traveled to Paris that spring, only expecting to negotiate for the port of New Orleans. They came home instead with an entire continent's worth of territory, at a price so low it worked out to roughly 3 cents an acre, because the man selling it needed the money and the war more than he needed the land. Most American history classes tell that story as a triumph of negotiation, a bargain won through the skill of Jefferson's envoys in Paris. Many historians push back on that framing today, and I find their case convincing. Napoleon wasn't simply generous or distracted. He was cutting losses on an American empire that had already collapsed in the Caribbean, and Haiti's resistance is the reason it collapsed. The sale price of Louisiana was, in a very real sense, written by soldiers fighting under Dessalines. Independence did not arrive into an empty room. The nation born at Gonaives stood alone on a map still crowded with slaveholding power. The United States to its north, still decades from abolishing slavery in a single one of its states. The British colonies across the Caribbean. Spanish Cuba just across the Windward Passage. French holdings like Martinique and Guadeloupe, where slavery would in fact be reinstated within the decade. Haiti was a single free Black republic ringed almost entirely by nations whose economies still depended on human bondage. That isolation cut in two directions at once. To enslaved people throughout the hemisphere, Haiti became living proof that freedom won by force was possible. Not theory, not scripture alone, but an actual functioning nation on the map. When Denmark Vesey was accused of planning a revolt in Charleston in 1822, investigators found that Haiti's example had circulated among the men involved. A real government they could point to and say, "It has already been done." To the slave-holding powers surrounding the island, that same fact made Haiti something closer to a threat than a neighbor. A free Black nation, governing itself, was treated by the powers around it less like a peer state and more like a fire that had to be contained before it spread. The containment was not subtle, and it did not stay confined to gossip and colonial parlors. The United States, the young republic that had itself just fought a revolution in the name of liberty, refused to formally recognize Haiti's independence for nearly 6 decades, a diplomatic freeze that only broke in 1862 under President Lincoln, in the middle of America's own civil war over slavery. Several southern states went further still, passing laws restricting Haitian sailors from even coming ashore, out of open fear that Black sailors carrying word of Gonaives might reach enslaved communities in Charleston or New Orleans. I believe that fear tells you plainly what those governments understood Haiti to represent. Not a curiosity on the map, a precedent they could not afford anyone at home to study too closely. 21 years after Gonaives, in the summer of 1825, the ships came back. Not an invasion force in the shape Rochambeau had once commanded, but something almost as unsettling in its own quiet way. A fleet of French warships, 14 of them, carrying an estimated 500 cannons between them, sailing into view off the coast near Port-au-Prince. For a nation that had spent 2 decades bracing for exactly this, the fear that France had never truly accepted 1804 as final. The sight of those sails on the horizon must have felt like history, circling back to finish something. Picture the harbor at Port-au-Prince that summer. Fishing boats pulled in early, merchants closing shutters, word running street to street that the French had returned, this time not with soldiers to land, but with cannon they didn't even need to fire. Nobody in that city needed a history lesson to understand what warships anchored just offshore were meant to say. The man who sent them was King Charles X, restored to the French throne after Napoleon's fall, and he arrived with an ordinance rather than an army of occupation. France would recognize Haiti's independence, formally and on paper, ending 21 years of diplomatic limbo. But recognition came with a price attached, and the price was not modest. Charles X demanded 150 million francs to be paid to France as compensation, not for any invasion, not for any debt of trade, but framed explicitly as compensation to French planters for the loss of their land and the people they had once enslaved. Officials of Vieira called it an indemnity, a term with a certain bureaucratic calm to it, the kind of word chosen precisely so it would not sound like what it was. I think it is worth naming plainly what it actually was: a bill charging the formerly enslaved for the value of their own freedom. Recognize this republic exists, the term said in effect, and in exchange, the people who won that existence at Vertières will spend generations paying the families of the men they defeated. The figure itself is difficult to hold in the mind at true scale. 150 million francs was roughly 10 times the annual revenue of the entire Haitian state at the time, a sum some economic historians estimate would run into the tens of billions of dollars in today's terms. It was not proposed as a negotiable opening bid. It arrived backed by warships already anchored within sight of the capital, cannons that did not need to fire a single shot to make their argument. Baron de Macau, the officer Charles X, sent to deliver the ordinance in person, carried instructions that left almost no room to negotiate the figure itself, only whether Haiti would sign or face renewed war with a European power. It had no realistic way of outlasting a second time. The message reaching President Jean-Pierre Boyer was blunt in every sense that mattered. Pay, and receive the recognition every other nation on earth had spent 2 decades withholding, or refuse, and watch those 14 ships decide what came next. Boyer's choice, when it came, was not really a choice at all, and I don't think it's fair to judge him as though it were. A young republic already isolated by nearly every major power, with no formal ally willing to intervene on its behalf, was staring down a European fleet that could blockade its ports, or worse. Within weeks, Boyer agreed to the terms. Haiti would pay. I've sat with the arithmetic of that moment for a while, and it never quite settles into something comfortable. 21 years earlier, an army of the formerly enslaved had beaten Napoleon's own soldiers on the battlefield and forced them off the island for good. A victory that cost France, by most accounts, tens of thousands of dead. Now a different French king was demanding payment for that same freedom, as though the war itself had never happened, as though a debt could be invoiced from men and women who had already bought their liberty in blood at Vertières. The exact machinery of how a nation with almost no access to international credit was expected to raise a sum 10 times its treasury, and what that debt would cost the country for more than a century afterward, is where this story goes next. Charles X had his fleet sitting in the bay, and he had his number written down, 150 million francs. That's where I left you. What almost never makes it into the retelling is what happened after Haiti said yes, Because this next part isn't a battle, it's a ledger. And a ledger, I've come to believe, can do more damage over a century than any army ever could. Here's the arithmetic nobody puts on screen. Haiti did not have 150 million francs sitting in the treasury because no young nation would. So the government borrowed it from French banks tied to the same financial world that had built its fortune on that colony in the first place. A loan, taken out to pay a ransom, owed to the country that had just enslaved an entire population.
I'll be honest, when I first read the term of this argument, I assumed I'd misread something. I hadn't. The figure got lowered later, down to around 90 million francs by 1838, and some accounts I try to treat that as a kind of mercy. I don't read it that way.
Lowering a ransom is still collecting one. It just means the country demanding payment for its own former colony's freedom decided 90 million was the more sustainable amount to extract. Year after year, decade after decade, that single decision in 1825 did not stay in 1825. The debt restructured, refinanced, and passed down through Haitian governments for generation after generation, still being paid into the 20th century, with the final installment not settled until 1947. 122 years. I don't think most of us can hold that number the way it deserves to be held. Somewhere in there, a formerly enslaved people were made to pay their former enslavers, in francs, for the freedom they had already won on the battlefield at Vertières. Picture what that meant for the country day to day. Because a number this large doesn't stay locked in a treasury ledger. It reaches into everything. In many of the years historians have studied, a majority of Haiti's national budget went straight out the door to French creditors before a single school, road, or hospital was funded. A nation is being asked to run itself on what's left over after the ransom is paid. And I think that's the part worth sitting with longer than the headline figure. Now here's a piece of this story that troubles me nearly as much as the debt itself. The United States, the nation built on the same promise of liberty Haiti had just fought and bled for, refused to even recognize Haiti as a country until 1862. 58 years of silence from a government that could have simply said the word, and didn't. Most of us were taught that recognition is a formality, a handshake between nations. I've come to see it differently. For a young Haiti, non-recognition meant no formal trade, no protection under international law, no seat at any table where its future was being decided. A handful of slave-holding powers understood exactly what recognizing Haiti would mean for their own enslaved populations, watching from a distance. And diplomatic silence was one more wall built to keep the example quiet, right alongside the debt. And so, in the American and European textbooks that shaped how generations understood this era, the Haitian Revolution rarely earned more than a footnote, if it earned one at all. You likely spent years in a classroom hearing about the French Revolution, the American Revolution, maybe even the Latin American Wars of Independence, and never once heard the name Vertières mentioned in the same breath. Most world history courses I've come across will spend a chapter on Napoleon's rise and barely a paragraph on the one army that ever handed him a defeat this total. That is not an accident of curriculum. It is what happens when a debt and a silence work together for over a century, quietly deciding which victories get remembered and which ones get filed away. Most teachers I grew up hearing from taught the era as one long story of European revolution and American expansion, with Haiti mentioned, if at all, as an afterthought or a cautionary tale. I've come to a different place than that. This wasn't a footnote. This was the fight that unsettled every slave-holding power watching, and that's exactly the story I'm about to finish telling you. So let's come back to where we started. The 2026 World Cup and a United States travel policy that let Haiti's national team walk through customs while it shut the door on the ordinary fans who had saved for years to watch them play. Picture that airport for a second. Players moving through the line with team badges and translators. Cameras waiting on the other side. And somewhere in the same building, a family that sold a car or worked a second shift for months to afford this trip. Standing at a counter being told their paperwork isn't the problem tonight. Their nation is. Same flag on both passports. Different treatment, depending on whether you were carrying a ball or carrying a suitcase. Between you and me, I don't think that's really about a World Cup at all. And I don't think it's really about paperwork either. Athletes get waved through because athletes are useful. They're visible. They photograph well standing next to a trophy. Ordinary people get stopped because ordinary people are the ones who might actually go home and tell the truth about what they saw. The ones who might come back changed by having simply been welcomed somewhere for once. I believe that's the same instinct this whole story has been about since 1825. Just wearing a 2026 cut of suit. Here's the pattern, and I want to name it plainly, because I think plain naming is the only honest way to close this out. This has never really been about one nation or one century. It's about how free black nations get treated by the powerful states around them, generation after generation, regardless of which century's uniform is doing the treating. France needed Haiti to look dangerous enough to justify collecting on a ransom for 122 years. Some of today's policy conversations still need Haiti, and nations that look like it, to look dangerous enough to justify a locked door at customs. I'm not telling you those two things are legally the same. I'm telling you they rhyme, and I think you heard the rhyme the moment I described that airport. Many of us who followed this story for years keep landing on the same uncomfortable observation. A nation can win its freedom outright, on the field of battle, with dates and generals and treaties to prove it, and 200 years later still be treated at a border as though the verdict were never settled. That's not a comment on Haiti. That's a comment on the state still deciding, quietly, that a free black republic makes them nervous. Which brings me to you, watching this right now. Whatever brought you to this video, you are the heirs of the army that broke an empire. And I do not say that lightly. On January 1st, 1804, a formerly enslaved people stood up and declared themselves the first black republic on earth. And they did not ask anyone's permission to do it. On November 18th, 1803, at Vertières, that same army broke the finest force Napoleon Bonaparte had left to send. In 1825, they were handed a ransom bill instead of an apology, and they paid it rather than let the story end in defeat. Those are not legends. Those are dates you can look up tonight.
I have been sitting with what that means for a long time, and here's where I have landed. If you grew up hearing this story in pieces or never hearing it at all, that absence was never a measure of its size. It was a measure of how much it frightened the people writing the textbook.
You carry the memory of Vertières whether or not a single teacher ever said the word out loud, and that is worth more than any line a curriculum committee left out. I keep coming back to Capois-la-Mort, the officer who kept charging the French line at Vertières, even after his horse went down under him, close enough that French officers on the other side reportedly stopped firing just to salute the nerve of it. I don't tell you that detail to romanticize a battlefield. I tell you because it's a receipt. The same as the dates are receipts. Real people with real names chose that morning, and what they won that day still has your name on it if you claim it. Now, before I close, I want to be honest with you about something. What I've told you today is one careful telling of this story, built from the dates, the battles, and the records historians have spent 2 centuries piecing together. I've done my best to get it right, and I've tried to give you names and years you can hold on to, rather than just a feeling. But I'd still encourage you to go check the primary sources for yourself. Read the eyewitness accounts. Sit with the numbers the way I did and come to your own understanding of what they mean. A story this size deserves more than one telling. And so I want to close the way I always do, with a prayer for justice that has been 200 years delayed, but not forgotten. For the memory of every name history tried to file away, from Bachmann in the mountains to Capois-la-Mort at Vertières. For the truth seekers watching this tonight, that you would keep asking the questions that make the comfortable version of the story fall apart, and keep the courage to sit with answers that aren't comfortable either. May the record be set straight, and may it stay that way for whoever comes looking after you. If this story moved something in you, I'd ask you to subscribe, because there's more of this history waiting to be told the right way. And if you know someone who's never heard the name Vertiers, send this to them. And I'd love to know, in the comments, where in the world you're watching this from tonight, and what part of the story stayed with you longest. The views and opinions expressed in this video are for educational, historical commentary, and entertainment purposes only, while deeply researched using available historical records and contemporary events. This content represents analytical commentary and should not be taken as professional legal, political, or financial advice. Viewer discretion and independent research are encouraged.